Hey guys, this is your host Nitin Binhani and a very warm welcome to my startup podcast channel Jazair Audio, where we share real stories with real learnings. So in today's podcast, I invited David B. Horn, the author of best-selling book Add Then Multiply, to share about his acclaimed FACE methodology, using which the founders can exponentially grow both their revenues as well as profits. It's worthwhile to note that David used the same methodology to gain 25x revenues as well as 11x profit growth within 3 years. So let's welcome today's special guest. Hi David, welcome to Jazair Audio and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you, Nitin. It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's start with, why is the organic growth method quite slow and limited for any venture?
Well, for startup companies, organic growth is how they get going. Organic growth is, finding customers and selling whatever your product or service is to them. So it's the way that every company starts out. But organic growth is hard work, and it takes companies time to get them going. And if you look at established businesses, it's very difficult for them to grow at faster than maybe 20-25% per annum, unless they're in a really, really hot sector. But if they're an ordinary business that's just looking to grow and develop, achieving 20-25% growth per annum consistently is a very, very difficult thing to do, because you got to find the customers and go out and win them and deal with the competition and all of that. So as I say, it's the way that every business starts out, but it's hard work to grow a company organically, consistently, year in and year out.
And what are the perils of scaling up or growing too fast?
Growing or scaling up too fast. The biggest peril in my experience is when the company itself is not ready for fast growth. So as businesses grow, you need to have structure as in the organization. You need to have the right kind of people inside the organization. One of the really key things that you need to have in place, and this applies really to every business, is that you need to have 3 distinct functions within each business. You need to have a sales and marketing function, which is responsible for finding and winning customers. And you need to have an operations function, which is responsible for delivering whatever your product or service is to your customer. And you need to have a finance function that's responsible for the money. So collecting money from your customers, paying your suppliers, paying your staff, paying rent, dealing with all of the fiscal and statutory requirements that you have to do for tax reporting and payroll reporting and all of that. And, when a company first starts out, it's often the owner that's fulfilling all of those functions. But as they grow, they need to bring people in to support that growth. And so the founder's role changes and evolves and develops from doing everything to being the person who leads a team of people and having experts in as a team of people who come in. So, oftentimes I've seen founders who kind of came in and they'll often have been very strong at the sales because they're very passionate about whatever their product or service is. Whereas, and they'll also be very good on the delivery side, but oftentimes they're not so good on the finance side. Some of them may not be good on one or two of the others. But basically what you need as the business grows and gets established is to have strong people in each of those functions. And if you don't, then you will very quickly grow out of control.
So what would you advise to the founders of the early stage startups?
The most important thing that an early stage business needs to do is be absolutely crystal clear on what their product or service is that they offer to the market, and be very, very clear on who their market is. And I see so many small startup businesses going out thinking, well, I've got this wonderful product and it'll apply to everybody. So what they need to do is really zero down on what is their target market. So zero down on your market and get very, very clear on what your market is. And the other thing is, in the very early stages, once you have that product or service and market defined, then everything that you do must be focused on finding and winning customers. Because unless you're in a really, really hot area of technology, investors are not going to put money into a pre-revenue business. It's just too risky.
So let's talk about your FACE methodology. How can entrepreneurs use the same to grow exponentially?
Well, exponential growth is really all about the execution of my FACE methodology, and it's based on experience that I gained initially between the years 2000 and 2010, where I was working with three very different companies, but they all had one thing in common, which was that they grew by acquisition. And so over these 10 years, it happened to have three roles that all had a lot of things in common. And when I decided to set up my own business, I thought, well, what is it that I have that's unique, not many people have? And it was really that experience of growing through acquisition. And that's what led to the book. And that's what led to development of the methodology that called FACE, which stands for Fund, Acquire, Consolidate, and Exit. And what I've done is I've taken strategy that large companies have used successfully for many, many years. And I've distilled it down to a level where it's understandable for entrepreneurs and it's executable by entrepreneurs in growing their business. And it's been particularly helpful over the last few years with the development of technology-led things that have enabled entrepreneurs to raise smaller amounts of money so that they can fund their operations and create a fund that enables them to expand. So that's sort of the fund side. If we then move on to the A is for acquire. So this is really where instead of growing out organically, you could go out and buy one of your competitors and put the two companies together. Or you could go out and buy an upstream supplier. So that way you would control a greater degree along that supply chain, because not only would you have the ability to make sure that you get your supply, but you can also control the price now on the supply chain so that strategically it could be more expensive for your competitors to acquire the products that they need. Or you could even look at acquiring a downstream customer, and again, just to ensure a continuous supply. So there's really three different areas that you can look at acquiring. I think the most common is to acquire a competitor and put those two businesses together. And for most entrepreneurs, that's the easiest one for them conceptually to understand, because it's doing what they do but taking over another company and merging the two of them together. Then if we move on to C is consolidate. This is the hard part, because this is where you're actually putting two companies together. And you've got a lot of things that you need to deal with. You'll have, two different companies might have had a history where, they fought against each other in the marketplace. So there's perhaps a bit of animosity between them. And so culturally, you need to work out how are you going to get things together, and so that the employees of the company that you've just acquired are happy to come in and form part of this bigger organization that you've now created. And it might be that you're going to have to do some cost savings, because they've got a certain set of infrastructure and you've got a certain set of infrastructure, and you don't necessarily need to duplicate it. Or it might be that you've got a situation where if you're an international business and you've got a subsidiary in, let's say, Sri Lanka, and the company that you buy has a subsidiary in Sri Lanka, well, you don't need two subsidiaries in Sri Lanka, so you can put them together. But it's also about what can we do to look at synergies. So it might be that you've acquired a company and half of what they do is very similar to what you do, but the other half of what they do is quite different, or their customer base is quite different. So that gives you an opportunity to take your products and services and sell them into a wider customer base. So it's quite a big strategic issue that you need to address. But there are huge opportunities in the consolidate stage of the FACE methodology that really enable an entrepreneur to maximize the value that they get out of doing it successfully. And equally, as a danger sign, if it's not done properly, this is where value gets destroyed. And then finally, exit. Exit is when it comes time for the entrepreneur to decide, okay, it's time for me to move on. I'm going to sell, whether that's because they want to retire, whether that's because they've just grown tired of the business, whether someone's simply come along and offered them a very attractive sum of money and they think, okay, well, I'll have a look at this. But the whole idea is that if you're stepping back and looking from the perspective of the entrepreneur, it's important to understand that there's a life cycle. So you're starting the business, you're growing it, you're acquiring, you're putting companies together, but don't forget that at some point in time, you're going to want to move on and do something else in your life. And that could be any of many, many things, but the exit stage is important for an entrepreneur to bear in mind.
And could you share an example or two as to how you used it?
So one of them is the business that I referred to in the book, where I worked directly with the founder of this company, and we grew the business through raising capital and buying other companies. So I joined that company and we had 1.1 million pounds of revenue. And over the next 3 years, we raised 60 million pounds on the stock exchange and bought 7 other companies and put them together into the group. And when I left, the group had a total revenue of 27.7 million pounds. So it had grown by 25x its revenue line. It had grown the profit line by 11x, and it's still a listed company on the stock exchange 15 years later. Although it's much smaller than it was at the time. It went through a pretty tough period during the financial crash in 2008, 2009. Over that short period, that was a huge example of growth. Another company I'm working with now, it's a privately held company where I've been working with the founder for the last 5 years. We haven't actually acquired any other businesses, but what we did is we raised £500,000 and acquired a team of people. So we used the money that we raised to invest in a team of people, to completely overhaul the technology of the business. And now, 5 years later, our EBITDA in the business is more than the revenue was 5 years ago.
Finally, how can the listeners get your book?
Yes, absolutely. So the book is called Add Then Multiply. It's available around the world on Amazon. So it's available in paperback and Kindle versions on Amazon. It's also available as an audiobook on Audible, on Spotify, on Apple Music. Just search Add Then Multiply and you should be able to find it. If people are interested in connecting with me, you can connect onto my website, which is addthenmultiply.com.
So with this, we have reached at the end of this podcast. David, it was a pleasure to have you on Jazair Audio, and thank you for sharing great insights.
It's my pleasure, Nitin. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope your listeners enjoy the show.
Are you a founder of an early stage startup and looking to raise funding? Get your startup investor ready before even you start pitching to your prospective investors. For know-how, please visit www.jazzaro.in. That is www.jazzaro.in.
Lastly, I want to thank all the listeners who took their valuable time to listen to this podcast. Keep rocking, be safe, and don't forget to share.